January 8th, 2003. A dry lightning storm ignites 4 isolated blazes in the ranges west of Canberra. Over 10 days, containment lines were breached one after another as severe conditions pushed the fronts into a unified inferno. On January 18th, at 3 p.m., that wall of heat reaches the city limits. The ensuing hours forced meteorologists to completely rethink severe weather dynamics. The encroaching front burned through the suburbs and spawned a towering pyrocumulonimbus plume. From that churning mass, a true pyrotornado carved through neighborhoods with terrifying velocity. In just 2 frames of amateur video, entire forests vaporized instantly. Scientists struggled to comprehend the physics underlying such unparalleled devastation. The morning of January 18th began under a sky tinted the color of rust. Families in Duffy, Chapman, Kamba, and Rivet woke to air tasting of bitter ash and radiant heat that felt like standing beside an open furnace door. For residents living in the Australian Capital Territory, seasonal warnings were a routine part of summer. National parks surrounded the region, and the 2002 to 2003 season had broken historical records for lack of rainfall. Standard emergency doctrine at the time instructed homeowners to stay and defend their properties. Authorities advised citizens to clear gutters, prepare hoses, and maintain watch. Planners assumed that fronts moved in predictable waves, meaning survival seemed assured if you were prepared. However, that fundamental assumption rested on standard combustion models, which meant it was about to fail catastrophically. By midday, ambient temperatures soared past 40 degrees Celsius while relative humidity plummeted into the single digits. 4 independent blazes, creeping through the ranges for over a week, finally merged into an unstoppable front stretching across the entire western horizon. Inside the Emergency Services Bureau Command Center in Curtin, controllers stared at radar screens flooding with erratic data. Heavy radio and phone traffic heavily congested communication channels and hampered situational awareness. Key evacuation warnings, which should have been issued hours earlier, were delayed by operational hesitation and major communication bottlenecks. Out in the suburbs, families anxiously monitoring their radios heard nothing. For those waiting for an official signal to flee, silence meant a death sentence. At exactly 2:30 p.m., the advancing front breached the final topographical ridge, beginning a rapid descent toward the urban interface. Spotters stationed at elevated lookout towers frantically reported a surging wall of thermal energy towering 200 meters high, advancing with the momentum of a runaway freight train. This forward edge slammed into the pine plantations bordering Duffy precisely at 3 o'clock p.m. Unlike native eucalyptus forests, these dense stands consisted of very resinous trees planted decades earlier for timber harvesting. Upon contact with the intense heat, these tracks practically detonated. Such intense thermal release rapidly engineered a localized microclimate. An immense column of superheated air rose rapidly into the upper troposphere, forming a towering pyrocumulonimbus structure. Deep inside that churning canopy, violent updrafts collided against shearing high-altitude winds, causing the entire column to begin rotating. Local resident Tom Bates stood his ground near the Canberra fire station, gripping a video camera. He'd spent the afternoon documenting the encroaching smoke, but what materialized inside his viewfinder at 3:15 p.m. defied every established meteorological precedent. A powerful, fire-induced rotating vortex began spinning rapidly beneath the pyrocumulonimbus plume. This phenomenon was vastly different from typical dust devil-like vortices that occasionally spin up near small brush fires. Bates was filming a violent pyrotornadic vortex exhibiting structural similarities to a mesocyclone, driven by concentrated localized surface heating rather than traditional synoptic scale mechanisms. The only difference lay in its composition. The vortex carried blistering heat, particulate smoke, and lofted burning debris through the atmosphere. Rotation tightened so much that the system generated localized, destructive wind shear, ripping mature trees out by their roots. He kept the lens focused, capturing one of the most thoroughly documented pyrotornadogenesis events in meteorological history. Moving east-southeast across open grassland near Mount Erewhong, the funnel carved a continuous path of total destruction. Splintered structures, crushed vehicles, and barren soil marked its trajectory. Yet, the most lethal aspect of this spinning vortex proved to be its aerodynamic suction. As the funnel progressed, it dragged a heavy influx of fresh oxygen directly into a steep gully previously smothered under thick, unburned combustion gases. Minutes of punishing radiant heat had cooked the surrounding vegetation, releasing volatile pyrolysis vapors that pooled in the valley basin. Lacking only oxygen to ignite, these suspended gases found their catalyst the second the cyclone passed overhead. Delivering a massive rush of ambient air, the vortex triggered a chain reaction. The vortex accelerated erratic fire behavior across the terrain. Frame-by-frame analysis later revealed that this entire expanse was rapidly engulfed in roaring flames. Though the central funnel dissipated roughly 10 minutes later, the huge thermal engine it fed continued marching forward. Peak energy output during that brief window easily eclipsed the yield of early atomic weaponry. Perched atop a prominent summit directly in the primary path, the historic Mount Stromlo Observatory faced total annihilation. Searing heat leveled mechanical workshops, administrative offices, 8 staff residences, and 7 specialized research telescopes. Installed at the site in 1911, the famous Audi refractor completely melted into its concrete foundations, while flames rapidly consumed the irreplaceable Great Melbourne Telescope. Only the 1886 Farnham Telescope, shielded inside a solid stone dome, managed to survive the onslaught. For over a century, this facility stood proudly as a cornerstone of Southern Hemisphere astronomy. In less than a quarter of an hour, it ceased to exist. Dorothy McGrath was 76 years old. She resided at Cottage 5 inside the Mount Stromlo Forestry Settlement, a quiet community constructed specifically for timber workers and their families. Dense plantation stands surrounded this enclave. When the front breached the uppermost ridge, its downward momentum accelerated far beyond any predictable evacuation timeframe. Roaring through the canopy, the blaze consumed the settlement's homes and infrastructure, leaving widespread destruction in its wake. Dorothy passed away inside her cottage, unable to escape a threat that outpaced human mobility. Years later, urban planners rebuilding the settlement chose to honor her memory. Dolly McGrath Street now winds through a residential area that bears no resemblance to the sprawling timber tracts that once stood there. 37-year-old Allison Tenner lived along the edge of Duffy, directly facing those volatile pine plantations that detonated earlier that afternoon. Years prior, her former husband David explicitly warned her about the grave danger those dense, non-native trees posed. He firmly believed that extinguishing a blaze in that specific tract would prove impossible. Despite those warnings, she maintained her residence. Following official guidance, she faithfully enacted her property defense preparations. Sadly, standard garden hoses offered zero protection against the onslaught of radiant energy and horizontal ember attacks that battered Duffy. Searing heat easily shattered reinforced glass, allowing ignited debris to penetrate interior spaces. Allison perished inside her home, proving David's grim predictions tragically accurate. Peter Brook was 74 years old. His property at 40 Tullaroop Street sat right in the hardest-hit section of Duffy, absorbing the full brunt of the urban interface breach. He lost his life alongside 3 other confirmed fatalities that terrible Saturday. Because urgent alerts never reached the public broadcasting networks, residents like Peter possessed no situational awareness regarding the speed or severity of the approaching danger. Bureaucratic bottlenecks and congested communication channels had paralyzed the emergency response apparatus. This sheer inability to process and disseminate incoming telemetry ultimately cost human lives. Burning fiercely throughout the night, the thermal mass finally shifted away from populated zones by the morning of January 19th due to a sudden change in wind direction. However, catastrophic damage already scarred the territory. Over 500 residential properties lay completely leveled or badly compromised. Medical personnel treated upwards of 490 individuals for serious burns and smoke inhalation. The Inferno also incinerated roughly 70% of the territory's grazing pastures, commercial plantations, and protected nature reserves. This extensive loss of vegetation triggered an immediate secondary crisis. Great quantities of ash, topsoil, and dissolved carbon began washing straight into municipal water catchments. Coron, Bendora, and Cotter dams, responsible for supplying the vast majority of the city's drinking water, suffered severe contamination. Within mere days, major water quality degradation disrupted standard distribution and forced the city to rely on alternative supplies while instituting strict restrictions. Strict rationing protocols remained rigidly enforced for many months. Coroner Maria Dugan eventually led the official Coronial Inquest, launching a relentlessly exhaustive investigation into the institutional breakdowns. Her final report highlighted deep systemic failures permeating every single tier of the governmental emergency response hierarchy. Emergency communications networks suffered heavy congestion, black spots, and operational failures, greatly hampering coordination lines. However, the subsequent release of her critical findings quickly descended into a bitter political battleground. Senior officials within the territory government filed multiple legal injunctions attempting to disqualify Dugan entirely, alleging inherent bias in her critical assessments of their operational protocols. These protracted courtroom skirmishes dragged on for years, continuously overshadowing the key logistical improvements that agencies desperately needed to implement. If this narrative is offering a new perspective, take a second to hit like. It genuinely helps the algorithm show this detailed analysis to more people who need to see it. Meanwhile, atmospheric physicists faced a daunting intellectual challenge. Small, localized vortices forming near heat sources were already well documented, relatively harmless occurrences. The footage captured by local observers, however, showcased a vastly different beast. Researchers officially coined the term pyrotornadogenesis to classify this terrifying new phenomenon. Seeking to understand the underlying mechanics, meteorologists utilized advanced supercomputer modeling to recreate the atmospheric conditions of that specific afternoon. They discovered that the main catalyst involved violent interaction between the storm's powerful localized updraft and high-altitude jet stream currents shearing horizontally across the troposphere. When these contrasting kinetic forces collided, they induced a broad, rotating mesocyclone high above the ground. This structural formation mirrored the exact genesis of violent springtime storms over the American plains. The fundamental difference lay strictly in the thermodynamics. Instead of drawing power solely from condensing ambient moisture, this particular system was supercharged by extreme heat release and moisture generated directly from the wildfire. Traditional computer models heavily relied on standard surface spread algorithms, assuming fire behavior followed predictable two-dimensional forward rate of spread calculations. Yet, that instantaneous, mass ignition event contradicted every existing mathematical algorithm. Researchers ultimately blamed gas phase chemistry for the anomaly. Fierce, radiant heat from the encroaching front had forced the hillside vegetation into pyrolysis, outgassing volatile hydrocarbons. Because complex terrain geometry created localized sheltered zones, these volatile vapors briefly accumulated in the depression. When the passing cyclone abruptly injected enormous volumes of fresh oxygen into the superheated cloud, the entire mixture achieved optimal stoichiometric balance. Instead of a creeping blaze, the event functioned as a terrain-wide volumetric explosion. As a result, Bates' amateur footage instantly became mandatory viewing within advanced meteorological programs worldwide. Over the following years, a sweeping reconstruction effort reshaped the affected suburbs. Modernized housing developments replaced the shattered neighborhoods, strictly adhering to newly established building codes. New regulations established stricter requirements for fire-resistant materials and upgraded glazing in designated bushfire-prone areas. Mount Stromlo Observatory rebuilt its shattered campus with state-of-the-art research facilities, while surrounding forestry settlements incorporated enhanced emergency management protocols. Yet, environmental scars remained starkly visible across the broader terrain. Conservationists replanted vast swaths of the surrounding national parks with resilient native species, permanently abandoning the flammable pine plantations. On January 18, 2024, community leaders, emergency responders, and survivors gathered at the official memorial site in Stromlo Forest Park to commemorate the 21st anniversary of the tragedy. Situated on a prominent ridgeline overlooking the reconstructed observatory, the monument features a solemn circular stone wall. Deep engravings list the names of the 4 individuals who lost their lives, alongside a detailed tally of the hundreds of destroyed properties. Guest speakers discussed the enduring psychological trauma, the dramatic overhauls in urban planning, and the shifting global baseline. Extended droughts, increasing seasonal temperatures, and shorter winter recovery periods mean the exact environmental variables that aligned in 2003 occur with alarming frequency today. In 2025, severe fire weather behavior was documented in both the Deer Creek incident in Utah and the Palisades emergency in Los Angeles, which forced rapid emergency evacuations across the region. Both incidents immediately drew direct comparisons to the seminal Australian event. The physics remain identical. Pyrotornadogenesis is no longer dismissed as an impossible statistical outlier. It represents an established, recurring hazard facing wildland firefighters globally. Modern meteorological satellites now utilize specialized infrared sensors to actively hunt for these developing mesocyclones, attempting to provide ground crews with mere minutes of advanced warning. The citizens who endured that dark Saturday carry the sensory experience with them forever. Survivors carry the deafening roar of the approaching front, the suffocating stench of vaporized eucalyptus, and the surreal memory of a sky turning pitch black at 3 in the afternoon. They remember the eerie, breathless silence immediately preceding the hit, the sheer physical force of its arrival, and the cherished friends who never made it out. Waking up the next morning, those survivors stood amid the smoldering wreckage, looking at ruined surroundings that bore no resemblance to the residential suburbs they once called home. The Canberra event provided a stark demonstration that our atmosphere and intense terrestrial heat can couple in ways previously thought impossible by modern meteorology. High ambient temperatures, prolonged moisture deficits, and dense fuel loads now routinely create environments where traditional blazes abandon conventional behavior and transform into aggressive storm cells. Large pyrocumulonimbus canopies, once relegated to obscure research papers as rare anomalies, now show up on Doppler radar arrays multiple times during a single summer season. Firefighters routinely film violent vortex structures that academics previously deemed mathematically impossible. Today, the modern Mount Stromlo Observatory campus sits securely on a hill protected by full bushfire and environmental management plans. The dense, volatile timber tracks are permanently gone. Advanced new telescopes sit safely housed inside fire-rated structures featuring expansive defensible space perimeters. The rebuilt staff residences adhere strictly to modern survival codes. However, that infamous western ridge still looms large over the valley, and on sweltering summer afternoons, when prevailing winds accelerate and humidity vanishes, local residents gaze toward that horizon and vividly remember. They remember the day nature aggressively proved that existing survival doctrines were dangerously incomplete. They remember witnessing vast expanses of terrain ignite in the blink of an eye. And they remember that 4 innocent people lost their lives despite following every single rule. Global forestry departments have exhaustively studied the lessons extracted from Canberra, rigorously incorporating those hard-won insights into modern tactical doctrine. But the fundamental, overarching challenge persists unabated. The precise atmospheric volatility required for pyrotornadogenesis appears with increasing regularity across multiple continents, universally replacing older strategies with aggressive, early evacuation protocols that incorporate automated smartphone alert networks alongside traditional broadcast channels. Yet, the underlying physical reality remains entirely unchanged. When a wildfire crosses a dangerous threshold of sheer intensity, it couples with the atmosphere and transitions into a violent, self-generated weather event. And weather events simply don't respect containment lines. If any of this stuck with you, take a moment to like and subscribe. There's so much more to uncover.